Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We've got a phenomenal guest lined up who unfortunately couldn't make it this week, so I'm a bit disappointed, but I wanted to bring him on in the coming weeks. It's from Palestine, from the West Bank, and I can't wait to share his story with you. This week, instead, we're going to talk about three really important things. I want to discuss affirmative action, especially in light of the Supreme Court having repealed it altogether. I feel like there's a lot of confusion on what affirmative action actually is. And I've talked to a lot of folks, not just on the right, but center, even center left, who don't understand what affirmative action is, how it works, why it works. They think it's a handout. They think it is an excuse to accept unqualified people, code word unqualified Black and brown people in particular. And not only is that just not true, it's actually not a very complicated concept. And so I'm disappointed that as a society, we haven't conveyed what it actually is and what it's actually supposed to be. And I think once I provide a little bit more breakdown, you're going to be even more upset, unfortunately, at how reckless the Supreme Court is to repeal it. And it's really just 3 points I want to make about affirmative action that I think is going to help you kind of have a better picture of what's going on. Second, speaking of not having full context, I don't think there's full context on the history of Israel-Palestine. And I'm going to go even further back than 1948. I'm going to talk about going back basically a couple thousand years to really explain how we got to where we are right now. And it's going to be a two-part conversation. I want to talk about the long-term history of it, and then I want to talk about the short-term history of it and what ultimately led to 10/7. Because at the end of the day, we can't know how we got here until we know where we came from, and we can't know where we're going unless we know how we got here. And I want to be able to provide that context to you guys. It's one of the most common questions I'm getting in my DMs, in my emails, to provide a broader overview over this, and I want to provide that here as best I can. And then finally, in the last part of the show, I'm going to do a quick, not a super deep dive, but enough in the few minutes we'll have about just the ongoing attacks on reproductive health that the GOP is engaging in. A horrifying story out of Mississippi of a 13-year-old girl becoming a mother because of confusion over the abortion ban. Obviously, she was assaulted, and her mother didn't know where she could take her, and physicians weren't willing to provide her the healthcare she needed. And now she's like a 7th grader with an 8-month-old child. It's just beyond the pale of humanity. And then trying to outdo each other in barbarity, the Texas GOP is contemplating adding to their platform that there should be the death penalty for women who seek abortion. I don't have the words to express my frustration, anger, outrage, and just bewilderment that this is a reality that we're dealing with in 2024 America. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Let me start doing a little bit. Let's talk about affirmative action, because I think there's something one successful thing that the right wing has done is take these principles, take these values, take these policies like affirmative action and make them into the boogie monster, make them into like the scary monster that if we don't repeal it immediately, it's going to destroy humanity. And if you're civilized, you'll repeal it. If not, you support it. And Democrats and people on the left just really aren't great at messaging, unfortunately. They're not great at messaging. And they capitulate and they buy into this nonsense. And so you probably notice these right-wing assaults on all things diversity related, whether it's their attacks on critical race theory, CRT, whether it's the demonization of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or on affirmative action. They've waged this all-out culture war on anything that makes them uncomfortable. And, South Dakota, for example, Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, the woman who shot a puppy and killed a puppy, because that's definitely what normal people do, sent an executive order of sorts to all the universities banning the use of pronouns in their email signatures, and banning the tribal affiliation. Let's just sit with that for a second. Banning pronouns and banning the tribal affiliation. I'm trying to understand this because South Dakota is named after the Lakota and Dakota Sioux Native American tribes. South Dakota has a tribal affiliation with it. Imagine being so stupid and racist. You give an executive order that's binding that bans mentioning the name of your own state. Like, do these people wake up one morning and decide, I'm gonna be even dumber today than I was yesterday? Is that like their goal of what they're trying to accomplish? I don't understand what this is supposed to do. But this is what the right has become, a kind of a caricature. And again, the scary part is that it's effective, and that's why we have to respond to it and address it. Because right now, it's not being addressed. More than 35 states have attempted to ban or have successfully banned CRT. More than 30 states are trying to do the same with DEI. And maybe I'll address these more directly in future articles or future episodes. But today, I want to provide this handy three-step guide to explain affirmative action to conservatives, especially given that our right-wing Supreme Court has repealed affirmative action. And we've talked in the past about how the Supreme Court has actually been the greatest obstacle to justice in America. And really it goes like this. First, explain the history of who affirmative action benefited the most, because it was not Black people. In reality, and this always shocks people when I tell them this, in reality, the demographic that benefited most from affirmative action, more than Black people, Indigenous people, Latinos, and Asians combined, are white women. It's a great report published in Time magazine about this, where it says, while people of color individually and as groups have been helped by affirmative action in subsequent years, data and studies suggest women, white women in particular, have benefited disproportionately. According to one study, in 1995, 6 million women, the majority of whom were white, had jobs they would not have had but for affirmative action. Another study shows that women made more than a 7 times greater gain in employment, 7 times greater, at companies that do business with the federal government, which are therefore subject to affirmative action, as opposed to businesses that do not do business with the federal government and therefore are not subject to affirmative action. And the comparison was 2% at non-affirmative action companies was the women employment, 15% at affirmative action companies. And even in the private sector, the advanced white women eclipse those of people of color. So the idea that this is, focused on race and giving Black people a free ride is just nonsense. If that was the accusation, if that was a reality, then that should apply on white women. But here's the thing, that's not the reality, because here's step 2. Explain that affirmative action was never about accepting unqualified people, whether they're women or people of color. Affirmative action was always about ensuring that underrepresented but qualified people also had a fair shot at acceptance. I'm going to say that again in a minute. But the background is, understand that universities and corporations systemically discriminated against non-white applicants for the entirety of American history, up through Jim Crow. The entirety. Like there's no point in American history where there was not systemic discrimination. It's why there was enslavement of Black people. It's why there was indigenous genocide. It's why women couldn't vote until the 19th Amendment. It's why women couldn't get their own financial credit until 1974, for God's sake, or why marital rape was not criminalized until 1993, for God's sake. So there was never a point in American history where Black and brown people and women had equal access under the law. And this is why even post-Civil War, Black Americans were forced to build historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, to ensure that Black children could obtain education, because even after the Civil War, white supremacists said, nope, we don't even want Black children to learn. So Black folks said, we're going to set up our own HBCUs, and now those are some of the most prominent HBCUs and universities in general out there. And by the way, they accept more white students than Ivy League schools accept Black students to this day. I think about W.E.B. Du Bois, famous Black civil rights scholar, writer, author, who lived from 1868 to 1963. He made history in 1895 as the first Black PhD graduate of Harvard University. And he very famously and beautifully said, quote, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's," end quote. Just such a baller line. I love that. That was amazing. Affirmative action, therefore, requires universities and corporations to finally also consider non-white applicants when making hiring decisions. So to repeat, affirmative action did not force universities and corporations to accept unqualified women and Black people. It required them to also consider qualified women and Black people. And the ample data backs up how such diversity has historically benefited the economy, it's benefited innovation, it's benefited growth on a national and international level over generations. And these claims that, well, we don't need affirmative action because we're in a post-racial society, really when? Because these facts don't back that up either. This is your meritless opinion, and you're entitled to it, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And finally, point out that if conservatives truly objected to unqualified admissions or acceptances, then they would have attacked and repealed what's known as legacy admissions, not affirmative action. Let me explain what that is, because the receipts make this clear. While conservatives protested all the way to the Supreme Court, the 8% Black students at Harvard, legacy admissions and sports admissions account for 43% of white students accepted to Harvard. So nearly every other white student at Harvard is accepted because of legacy. Legacy meaning that if your father or grandfather, in which case they went during Jim Crow, got admission, then you get highly default admission, highly preferred admission. And you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't mean anything, that they're perfectly qualified. No. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, so an academic study, looked at all these grades, looked at all these qualifications, and found that of those 43% white students admitted to Harvard who received a preference for being legacy or being the child of a faculty or staff member, 75% of them would have been rejected without those advantages. They would not have gotten accepted on merit alone or at all. So in other words, if the conservative outrage was truly about the lack of meritocracy, then their exclusive target should have been legacy admissions. Even if we go with the false claim that every single Black person admitted was admitted due to affirmative action and was unqualified, the number of those admissions is still dwarfs in comparison to the number of unqualified white legacy students admitted. Year over year, decade over decade, century over century. But yet, we find complete silence from conservatives on this fact. I cannot imagine why that would be the case. Of course not, because we're in a post-racial society, so that could never be a racist thing at all. So I'm hopeful that these three facts, one, that the demographic that's benefited most from affirmative action has been white women, more than all other racial demographics combined. That two, affirmative action was never about accepting unqualified people. It was always about ensuring that underrepresented people who were qualified also got a fair shot at acceptance. And three, if meritocracy really was your shtick, if that's really your jam, if that's your favorite song, then you should be attacking legacy admissions. Because at Harvard, at least 3/4 of the white students who got legacy admission would not have qualified on merit at all. But we're not having conversations about that. That's not what conservatives want to talk about. They just want to make this culture war and demonize Black and brown people. But here's the thing, the facts don't lie. The movement to repeal affirmative action or to ban DEI or to ban or demonize CRT, it was never about merit. It was never about applicants' qualifications. It was always about reviving Jim Crow white supremacy. And the scary part is, so far, it is working. That's a horrifying part. So I'm hopeful that these facts help you at the inevitable conversation with a conservative family member or a friend. I've published this on my Substack. You can check it out there, subscribe there as well. But until we start to have these conversations more aggressively and assertively and lead the narrative and drive the narrative, we're in trouble. We can't be reactive. We need to lead from the front. All right. When we come back from break, I want to do a deeper dive into the history of Muslim-Jewish relations as it leads to Palestine. We're seeing a horrific ongoing assault that the ICJ is now describing as a genocide. And there's this belief that this is a religious war. And I think that's not only false, it's dangerously false. Because when you fall into that propaganda, you make it extremely difficult to resolve. But in fact, this is not difficult to resolve if we uphold human rights law, if we uphold a sense of justice. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I wanted to spend some time doing a deeper dive on the history of Israel-Palestine. There, again, there are two major issues. One, there's just a great deal of ignorance to it. And ignorance in and of itself is not a bad thing. But the second part is what makes it bad is that people are acting on that ignorance. There's a lot of misinformation that's resulting. And when you're talking about something as horrific as what's happening in Rafah, for example, right now, where children are literally being beheaded and incinerated in their sleep, it's critical that we recognize the history to understand how we got here and understand how we resolve these conflicts, because it's not going to happen through misinformation. I've talked a little bit about this on the show before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. I really don't have the words to express my outrage here, because the number of innocent lives being lost, it's all preventable. It's all preventable if we uphold justice in the work we're doing. A Jewish friend, recently sent me a meme, and I want to emphasize that this meme, as offensive and backwards as it is, this Jewish friend of mine sent it to me because they deeply care about justice and humanity, which, in my experience, the vast majority of Jews and Muslims do and are working to resolve this. It's the minority that's causing the issues. And so this Jewish friend and I have worked together on issues in the past, and they sent it to me as a heads up and as a request to provide context for those who might fall victim to this dangerous misinformation. It's two women talking, and the first woman says, isn't the Israeli-Palestinian conflict just a Middle Eastern argument over land between Muslims and Jews? To which a second woman responds, and by the way, these women are depicted like white, like super white. You know, if they're supposed to be Jewish, then okay, but like they're depicted as super white. And there's a whole nother conversation about the right of return, and that's a whole different conversation. But the second woman responds, yes, this is an argument over land between Muslims and Jews, but it's not the first. Jewish people have lived in Jerusalem for thousands of years, and they've lived in the Middle East for ages, being oppressed and raped and murdered by the Arab Empire, like Palestinian Christians. Like, it's just such a provocative and absurd response. And by the time I received this meme, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. Deborah Messenger, whatever, I think Messenger, I think that's her last name, promoted it on her, large network. And at a time of immense anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, these memes only advance hatred. They create fear, misinformation, and bigotry, and it's a dangerous misrepresentation of history. It creates anti-Muslim hate, anti-Semitic hate, not to mention the complete erasure of Palestinian Christians as well, as if Palestinian Christians are just sitting there, being abused by Arab Muslims. Like, such a nonsensical comment to make. And it's why having this platform is important to me, because at the end of the day, we need to be able to respond and debunk this. And so I want to start from the beginning. When the year 622 rolled around, the founder of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, left Mecca after a dozen years of brutal persecution, and he arrived about a month's journey away, about 220 miles away, in a city-state called Medina. Now, Medina was a predominantly Jewish city-state with a growing Muslim population as well. And historically, this was the first meaningful, consequential interaction between a Muslim government, if you want to call it that, and a Jewish government. And if there was ever an indication of what the future might hold, this would have been it. There should have been fighting, there should have been infighting, there should have been a land grab. But on the contrary, they joined and formed a new government together, uh, and established what was now known as, or what is now known as, the Constitution of Medina. It was then called the Charter of Medina. The Charter of Medina, established in 622, was history's first secular constitution. I mean, it's preceded the Magna Carta by 600 years, just to put that in perspective, right? And it mandated a separation of religion and state, and it united the Muslims and the Jews as an alliance. It had 57 articles. I'm not going to go through all 57, but there's two that I want to mention that I think are extraordinarily relevant to this conversation. Article 17 said clearly, in no uncertain terms, no Jewish person shall be wronged for being a Jewish person. Right? Just a flat out rejection of anti-Semitism and any attempts to dehumanize Jewish people. Article 18 added, the enemies of the Jewish people who follow Muslims will not be helped. And so the Muslims were so confirmed and solid on their alliance with the Jewish people of Medina that they said that if we have an ally, but that ally is opposed to the Jewish people that we've set this contract with, this constitution with, well, tough luck. We're not helping that ally anymore. We're aligned with Jewish people now, so they're not going to be helped by us. We're breaking that alliance to strengthen this alliance. That was a powerful statement as well. It goes on to explicitly confirm the humanity of Jewish people as equal to Muslims in Article 42. It adds the obligations of Muslims to protect not only Jews, but even allies of the Jews who are not mentioned in the Charter, Article 34. So again, not only were they willing to give up their own allies, but they said, we'll adopt your allies in a means to show how genuine we are in building this bridge. And this ironclad commitment, it's one thing to put it in writing, but then what happened when it was put to the test? And pretty soon we found out. It would be put to the test as war would impose itself on Medina just a few years later. And Medina was subsequently attacked in the following years in what is now known as the Battle of the Ditch. And it's called the Battle of the Ditch because they built a literal ditch around the entire city to protect it from attack. And the history books record that Prophet Muhammad and the Muslims actively defended Jews from attack and from being killed, and they protected Medina's unified sovereignty and sanctity. Meanwhile, about 6 years later, and some 600 miles away, Byzantine Christians conquered Jerusalem. And they forcibly expelled all Jews from the holy city. A massacre of Jews ensues, and going forward, Jews are forbidden from settling in Jerusalem and were forced, by some accounts, to live at least 3 miles outside the city walls. And so the Prophet was alive, but he was in Medina at the time, and this atrocity was committed against Jews, not by Arabs or Muslims, nope, because they had an alliance with the Jewish people, and they remained steadfast in alliance. This was a massacre committed by the Byzantine Christians. 632, Prophet Muhammad dies. And now, once again, his death tests whether this alliance he made with Jews was, in fact, going to remain intact. This promise of protection of Jews from harm, would it remain intact? 638, 6 years after his death, this question is emphatically answered when Caliph Umar, the second caliph, conquers Jerusalem and retakes it from the Byzantine Christians. And as among his first orders of business, what does Umar do? He reopens Jerusalem for Jews to enter and live peacefully, to re-enter and to live peacefully and without persecution. The restrictions in movement and in residency that the Byzantine Christians had imposed upon the Jewish people, these are lifted altogether. In fact, even the Christians, remember this meme talked about how the Christians were raped as well? No, the Christians are allowed to remain in Jerusalem on the condition that, hey, stop waging war and you can hang out. And they did. And history records Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in relative peace under Muslim rule for the next 461 years. Soak that in for a moment. The United States only existed for less than 250 years. But for nearly double the existence of the United States, Jews and Christians and Muslims lived peacefully under Muslim rule in Jerusalem. That unity continued until Christian crusaders retook Jerusalem from the Muslims in 1099. And unsurprisingly and horrifyingly, another massacre ensues, not committed by Arabs or Muslims, but of Muslims and of Jews at the hands of Christian crusaders. And from 1099 to 1187, for about that 88-year period, the first crusaders conquered Jerusalem and committed a well-documented massacre of the previous Jewish and Muslim residents of Jerusalem. But true to the Constitution of Medina, signed some 467 years prior, the Jews and Muslims fought side by side. They fought side by side against this invading army, and unfortunately they lost. But that pact remained intact. And those who survived this war were then once again expelled from Jerusalem altogether. That is, until 88 years later, until the year 1187, in which year General Salahuddin launched a successful campaign against the Crusaders and once again retook Jerusalem. And guess what he did? True to the covenant established more than 500 years prior, General Salahuddin allows Jews to once again re-enter Jerusalem, just as Caliph Omar did centuries prior. He furthermore ensures that native Christians can remain in Jerusalem. And the history books record that there was this symbolic tax imposed upon the Christian conquerors to leave, that they're acknowledging their defeat, and the wealthy and the churches took the money they had and they left, which is also unheard of, and refused to pay the tax for the poor Christians. And so what did General Salahuddin do? He went into his own coffers and paid the tax on their behalf. And then as an additional act of sincerity, as an additional act of goodwill, what does he do to the Holy Sepulchre of Christ? He guards it. He guards it from attack, from vandalism or destruction, and allows full access to it to the Christian residents of Jerusalem. All this contrary to this malicious allegation of rape of Palestinian Christians. In fact, to this day, in 2024, the Holy Sepulchre is honored under Muslim protection. I visited it myself. I've seen it myself. It's a Muslim family who opens it every morning, unlocks it every morning, and locks it up and cleans it up every night. Again, to emphasize the point once more, Jews and Muslims lived in relative harmony and in peace without any such incidences of rape and murder by the Arab Empire. Now we're 500 years in. And again, from 1259 to 1516, there were, under what was the Mamluk reign, there were several notable Jews and Christians in high-ranking positions in this Muslim-majority government of Jerusalem. And to be sure, this was not utopia. I don't think any government or any reign or any country has ever experienced utopia. But likewise, there's no such examples of this mass murder and rape that we keep hearing about. And this reign lasted until 1517, when the Ottomans took over Jerusalem. And again, from 1517 to 1917, 400 years of Muslim rule, we once again see history record relative peace and rapid growth of the Jewish population in Jerusalem. This era amounted to the third multi-century reign of Muslim leadership, in which Jews lived in Jerusalem, protected by Muslims from outside attacks, free to practice and worship without oppression. Third multi-century reign. This alone should suffice as evidence that Muslims and Jews have long lived in peace and harmony with one another, that this is not some religious war that we're seeing right now. And by the way, this wasn't only in the Middle East. Vastly contrary to the treatment of Jewish people under the Christian kingdoms of Europe, in Moorish Spain, we see 700 years of Muslim rule and 700 years of relative peace between Muslims and Jews and Christians. There's a great book written by Professor Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, where she talks about how the country had people who were religious and honest. Their reign was tranquil. There was no revolt. Their days are happy and prosperous. There was no tribute or tithing or tax. except for the charity tax. Prosperity grew, the population rose, people could freely attend to their own affairs, crime was at a minimum. And even after the Moorish Empire fell, other chroniclers of Islamic Spain praised them. And they wrote how that learning was cherished and literacy was widespread and scholars were subsidized and capital punishment was abolished. And their economy and gold coins were pure and reliable weight. And that Christians and Jews lived in tolerance within the realms. And even if some Christians rose up in revolt, they were not given capital punishment, but merely exiled. But then she ends with a really interesting critique of Moorish Spain. She says that they were criticized for being excessively influenced by their women. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think we could use a government that has too much influence by women in contemporary times as well. And the fall of Moorish Spain saw this massive rise in anti-Semitic violence and pogroms against Jewish people. And this is well documented. For example, preceding the groundwork that Christopher Columbus laid and the Catholic Church laid to ignite what would soon become the transatlantic slave trade and genocide of Native Americans. Prior to all that, Professor Bourne writes how Columbus wrote to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in his diary, he wrote a letter. He says, "Your Highnesses, as Catholic Christians and princes who love the holy Christian faith and the propagation of it, and who are enemies of the sect of Muhammad and to all idolatries and heresies, resolve to send me, Cristobal Colon, to the said parts of India to see the said princes with a view that they might be converted to our holy faith." And then listen to this part. He goes, "Thus, after having turned out all the Jews from all your kingdoms and lordships, your Highness gave orders to me that with a sufficient fleet, I should go to said parts of India. I shall forget all sleep and shall work at the business of navigation so that the service is performed." Again, attesting that even if there were instances of conflict, Muslims and Jews lived in consistent harmony with one another, and both suffered horrific atrocity at the hands of Christian crusaders and genocidal maniacs like Columbus. And so, returning to the point at hand here of what's going on contemporarily, it's critical to recognize that shortly after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the state of Israel is created in 1948. And this history from 1948 to 2024 warrants a thorough analysis. I'm going to provide that here in just a second. But before I even get to that point, for the purposes of this article, or for the purposes of this part of the dialogue, history consistently records that from 622 to 1917, a span of nearly 1,300 years, there was no mass generational discrimination or rape and murder of Jewish people or Christian Palestinians, certainly not under Muslim rule or at the hands of Muslims. On the contrary, under Muslim rule, Jewish people were consistently protected from persecution and annihilation. They were consistently allowed access to Jerusalem to worship freely and to live without oppression. History records no example of Muslims proactively targeting and harming Jewish people for being Jewish. In fact, remember, the Constitution of Medina, ratified by the Prophet Muhammad himself way back in 622, specifically forbade harming Jewish people for being Jewish. And so let's talk about this contemporary injustice. Let's talk about what's going on right now, because demanding better not only begins with honesty about history, but also about recognizing the current contemporary injustices that are being committed, of why we need an immediate ceasefire and a release of all hostages and an end to this arms trade, of why we need to end the illegal military occupation, the illegal settlements, why Palestinians deserve an independent sovereign nation, why they deserve a right to return. This is how we revive this long history of mutual coexistence that Muslims and Jews initiated. And this is what I want to talk about right now in this next few minutes. Look, there are no shortages of misinformation, and I keep getting these phrases sent to me that, well, don't start wars that you can't win, or there was a ceasefire on 10/6, or maybe Palestinians should have thought of their children before they attacked Israel. And these comments and many more cruel comments like them have inundated the social media spectrum, the media landscape, and the politician talking points since 10/7. There's only one problem. None of these claims are grounded in reality. And so let's think about where we are right now. Over the past 6 months, Israeli bombing has killed more than 35,000 Palestinian civilians, with 70% of them being women and children. And I've come to realize that I really can't have a logical discussion on Israel-Gaza with people who believe that this current atrocity began on 10/7. And and I'd say that what Hamas committed was a war crime because killing civilians is a war crime. And I add that labeling 10/7 as the ignition of this conflict and not part of a decades-long trail of violence grounded in political injustice, that claim is, claiming that it started on 10/7 isn't just false, it's dangerous propaganda. It harms Israelis and Palestinians. His falsity assumes that life before 10/7 was peaceful and all, happy-go-lucky for Palestinians. It assumes that Hamas is an instigation and not a reaction. And reality demonstrates that they are a reaction. So let's talk about this history, right? We've talked about the long history up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Let's talk about after the creation of Israel, which again, Palestinians were there, right? The line was that it's a land for a people without a land, or a land without a people given to a people without a land. But Palestinians were there. It's not like it was a barren wasteland. There was a country of Palestine. And so Israel's created, and then we get to the 1967 war. And Israel has never actually defined its boundaries since then. And so we have to recognize that Israel's 57-year illegal military occupation of Palestine is illegal. Agnes Callamard, Amnesty International's Secretary General, says that the world must recognize that ending Israel's illegal occupation is a prerequisite to stopping the recurrent human rights violations in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel's occupation of Palestine is the longest and one of the most deadly military occupations in the world. For decades, it has been characterized by widespread and systemic human rights violations against Palestinians. The occupation has also enabled and entrenched Israel's system of apartheid imposed on Palestinians. Over the years, Israel's military occupation has evolved into a perpetual occupation in flagrant violation of international law. I mean, that's a pretty damning statement. And in addition to that, we have to recognize that as a result of this illegal occupation, Hamas was the reaction. Hamas isn't like back from the year, 800. It was established in 1987, for God's sake. It's younger than me. And it was a reaction to more than 2 decades of illegal occupation and land grab. And by the way, Hamas funding came with the approval and support of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu as a way to delegitimize Palestinian statehood. The Times of Israel reports on this, so have Haaretz and so are many other organizations, but Times of Israel reports for years, the various governments led by Benjamin Netanyahu took an approach that divided power between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, bringing Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to his knees while making moves that propped up the Hamas terror group. The idea was to prevent Abbas or anyone else in the PA in the West Bank from advancing towards establishing a Palestinian state. And they did so by propping up Hamas. Netanyahu personally made sure that suitcases full of cash were driven into Gaza and hand-delivered to Hamas leadership. He made sure of this. He said that our strategy is to prop up Hamas to prevent a Palestinian state. If Hamas is so horrible, why is Netanyahu propping him up? It's a question for Netanyahu. I'm not the one saying that. That's Netanyahu's question to answer. And in addition to that, due to all this time, Israel has built 700,000 illegal settlements in violation of international human rights law. And the UN has repeatedly affirmed this. Listen to this UN press release on September 27th, 2023, just 10 days before the October 7th attack. They cite who? The United States itself. And they say the representative of the United States said the ongoing violence between Israelis and Palestinians set back prospects for peace and is responsible for so much needless suffering. Voicing concern over the situation in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, she said, the U.S. representative said, that the United States opposes the advancement of settlements and urges Israel to refrain from those actions, emphasizing that it undermines the geographic viability of a two-state solution, exacerbates tensions, and further harms trust between the two parties. This is 10 days before the 10/7 attack. The U.S. is condemning Israel for building these settlements. And then finally, we have to recognize that more than 2 decades of a land, air, and sea blockade on Gaza have left people desperate and distressed. We have to recognize that while we absolutely and unequivocally want the 150 or so hostages in Hamas custody returned to Israel, we cannot forget about the 9,500 Palestinians in Israeli prisons in indefinite detention who have been given no charge, no opportunity for release. NPR reports that administrative detention is a form of detention whereby individuals are detained by the state of Israel without any intent to prosecute them in a trial, and they're held on the basis of secret security information that the detainee and their lawyer cannot review. Israel has been using this form of detention since its occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip back to 1967. Of those 9,500, 1,000 are children who are indefinitely detained, again, without charge, under so-called administrative detention. These children are denied access to counsel or parents, and as Save the Children report, they're suffering horrific abuse. Palestinian children, this is according to Save the Children international reports, Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system face physical and emotional abuse. 4 out of 5, 86%, are physically beaten. 69% are strip searched. Nearly half, 42%, are injured at the point of arrest, including gunshot wounds and broken bones. There are reports of sexual violence, and some are transferred to court or between detention centers in small cages. It is estimated up to 1,000 children are held in detention every single year. If a foreign government took your child, held them, didn't tell you where they were or what they're being held for, and you knew they were suffering physical and sexual abuse, is that not a hostage taking? Is that not a kidnapping? And are Palestinians not justified in being outraged about this? The idea that there is peace on 10/6 is already betrayed by all the facts that I shared, but let me share one more. In the year prior to 10/7, the Israeli military killed at least 240 Palestinian civilians, and this is in the West Bank. If you add the number killed in Gaza, the number is even higher. And this death toll included 47 children. In fact, it was the deadliest year in history for Palestinians killed by the Israeli military. To call that a ceasefire is just to betray reality. And so, just back to my original point, if we want to have a serious discussion on Israel and Palestine, but you only started paying attention on 10/7, then you're not engaged in good faith, period. Even since 10/7, Amnesty International reports that the Israeli military has killed an additional 300 Palestinians in the West Bank, where there is no war. They're just killing civilians because they can get away with it. And this is probably the first you've heard about it. So the refusal to engage in good faith dialogue that accounts for historical reality is harmful to both Palestinians and Israelis because such ignorance and denial of history, it prevents meaningful solutions. So what is the solution here? Well, one, recognizing this history. Two, I commend ICC prosecution Karim Khan for charging Hamas and Israeli leadership with war crimes, and hope that the ICC judges issue warrants for their arrest. And ultimately, we know we have to uphold international human rights law, which means an end to the occupation, an end to the settlements, a release of all hostages on both sides, and a prosecution of war crimes, and now a rebuilding of Gaza. As a human rights lawyer, my focus is international human rights law. I believe it's a force for good. And I seek nothing more than the safety and security of both Palestine and Israel, of Palestinians and Israelis. But to get to that point, we have to first recognize the history of this conflict before 10/7, recognize that the history of Muslims and Jews has largely been peaceful, and recognize that we have the tools of international human rights law to stop the atrocities happening right now. All right, when we come back from break, I want to do a quick rundown of the horrific anti-abortion bills going on in some of these states and what we can do to play a role to counter these injustices. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I want to close this episode with a kind of a depressing story. It's a horrifying story. A 13-year-old rape victim has a baby in Mississippi amid confusion over the state's abortion ban. And the law enforcement used DNA from the baby to apprehend the suspect, but the story is Regina, a mother of three daughters, lives in one of the poorest counties, one of the poorest states in the country, Mississippi. I think it is the poorest state in the country. And in late 2022, she noticed that her middle daughter, Ashley, began withdrawing, quit the cheer team, stopped going outside, started to get really sick, started vomiting a lot, took her to the hospital, and they said, "You are pregnant." And Regina says, "I broke down and started crying." Ashley was 11 weeks pregnant at the time. She was raped by a stranger in the yard of the family's home. Only 12 years old, 12-year-old child. And to make it even more horrifying, amid confusion over what abortion care is allowed in Mississippi, they said that they were unsure how it applies for the alleged exception for cases of rape. And with the heavy restrictions, they just were not able to get an abortion. Because no doctor was willing to perform it for fear of being stripped of their license, thrown in jail, you name it. Ashley's now 13, the mother of an 8-month-old baby, and she's in seventh grade. She's in seventh grade. And these names I'm using, the article says that these are pseudonyms, they're not real names, to protect their identity. But this is the reality of what Republicans want. And Mississippi, already a state that is the poorest in the country, that already has created this white supremacist construct, is trying to make this more difficult. There were only 4 abortions performed in the state in 2023, and this is making for a situation where it's going to get even worse, because you have a drop from 3,800 in 2021 to 4 in 2023, and the level of poverty and the level of maternal mortality is only increasing. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Every study shows that abortion bans do not decrease abortion rates. They increase maternal mortality by at least 24%. Texas is saying, we're going to try to outdo Mississippi. And the Texas GOP is considering a platform that calls for women who get abortions to face the death penalty. This is being reported by the Texas Tribune. And they're flat out saying that this is a pro-life issue, and that they want to include a proclamation that abortion is not health care, it is homicide. And in Texas, capital murder is punishable by the death penalty or life in prison without parole. This category applies to cases with aggravating factors, such as multiple murders of an individual under the age of 6, etc., etc. But the fact remains that now they're trying to push and normalize this. They're trying to push the Overton window. And this goes back to what Donald Trump said years ago, that he thinks women who get abortions should be punished. And this is what the Texas Republican Party is trying to do. And I want to emphasize that if the Texas Republican Party is trying to do this, other Republican parties around the country, including the National Party, are absolutely trying to do this as well. This is how these kinds of laws work. One state passes it to test the water. If it worked, then other states put out copycat laws as well, and they try to make it federal. And now with this absurd right-wing Supreme Court that they have, they're able to accomplish this. The call to action that each of us can take here is to be involved in your local politics, be involved in your state politics, and make sure that you are haunting their dreams. Make sure you are attending their meetings, their town halls, you're calling them, you're emailing them. Make sure that you're investing in these local candidates as well, knocking doors, making phone calls. You'd be surprised at how much power this particular issue has in winning over votes. Even in the deepest red states like Kansas and Montana, abortion ballot measures have been extraordinarily successful, with more than 70% supporting. And so even in the most right-wing areas, there is hope that we can get people out to vote on these issues and vote against these horrific bans. So don't lose hope. Stay active and stay engaged, because this is one way we can turn the tide and push you over to the window. All right, my friends, thank you for tuning in. I know this is a heavy show today. We've got a great one lined up for next week as well, but I appreciate your ongoing support. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you subscribe and continue to support my advocacy there. Be sure to follow me on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. I'm going to continue to advance a show that builds on compassion, justice, and accountability for those in power. I'm excited to share our guest next week. Be sure to tune in, same time, same place at 10 a.m. on Sunday on Sirius XM Urban View channel 126. The most awesome show in the multiverse. My friends, be fierce and lead with compassion and justice and continue speaking truth to power. Until next week, peace.